Picture the Iberian Peninsula at dawn. A land of jagged mountains, sunburned plains, and coasts kissed by two seas, the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. It is here that Spain begins, a country forged in both fire and silence. To tell the story of Spain is to step into a theater where tragedy and triumph perform side by side, each act leaving scars that shimmer like metals. Spain is not just a name on a map. It is a paradox. Once, it commanded an empire where, as contemporaries said, the sun never set. From the silver mines of Potosi to the trade galleons of Manila, Spanish power reached the edges of the known world. Yet the same empire crumbled from within, collapsing into poverty, division, and civil wars. Spain has known dazzling glory, but it has also swallowed bitter defeat. It has stood proud like a warrior in shining armor, and it has fallen broken like that same warrior bleeding on the battlefield. This contradiction is Spain's essence. Every stone of its cathedrals, every verse of its poets, every cry from its bull rings whispers of both conquest and loss. Spain is a country where light always casts a long shadow. The grandeur of its palaces sits beside the ruins of its forgotten villages. Its history is a mirror cracked by war and religion, yet reflecting resilience and rebirth. To understand Spain, we must accept this duality, a nation of saints and heretics, conquerors and martyrs, visionaries and tyrants. Each century seems to swing the pendulum between splendor and despair. And yet, through it all, Spain never disappears. It dies, only to be reborn. Think of the scars as symbols. The Reconquista's 8 centuries of blood, the Inquisition's flames, the civil wars bombed out towns. These are wounds that never fully closed, but they are also testaments to survival. Spain does not hide its scars. It carries them openly, like battle marks on the face of an old soldier. And what of its glory? The golden age of Cervantes and Velázquez. The global empire stretching across oceans, the voices of flamenco echoing from Andalusian taverns, the roar of Real Madrid and Barcelona filling stadiums. These are Spain's shining medals. They are reminders that even in ruin, the Spanish spirit insists on beauty. So let us ask ourselves, how much do we truly know about this land? Do we know Spain beyond the cliches of siesta and fiesta, beyond the postcard of a bullfighter under the blazing sun? Do we see the centuries of struggle hidden beneath the music, the art, the language spoken today by 500 million people across the world? This is not just the story of a country. It is the story of survival, of a nation that has been conquered and yet has conquered, that has been silenced, yet has sung louder than most. Spain is both the blade and the wound, the prayer and the curse, the empire and the exile. And so, we begin this journey through the full history of Spain, through caves and castles, through empires and ashes, through kings and commoners. We will see how a small corner of Europe became the stage for some of the greatest dramas in human history. And we will ask, again and again, what is Spain, if not the endless cycle of fall and rebirth? This is the story of scars and glory. This is the story of Spain. Long before Spain was Spain, before kingdoms and crowns, before the cross and the crescent, there were shadows moving across a land untouched by history. Imagine the Iberian Peninsula in the Paleolithic age. Dense forests, wild rivers, herds of bison and deer running across open plains. The first humans here, our ancestors, Cro-Magnon hunters, lived not in palaces, but in caves, their lives bound to the rhythm of survival. It is here, in this silence of prehistory, that one of humanity's greatest miracles appeared. The paintings of Altamira. discovered in the 19th century but created over 15,000 years ago. The cave of Altamira in northern Spain is often called the Sistine Chapel of prehistory. On its walls, bisons leap in shades of ochre and black. Wild boars charge and deer seem to run across stone ceilings. These were not mere doodles of idle hands. They were rituals, prayers in color. With strokes of charcoal and ochre, those early people reached for something greater than survival. They reached for meaning. Close your eyes and imagine the flicker of firelight inside the cave. The walls come alive as the flames dance. To the hunter, this was not art, but magic. By painting the bison, perhaps he could capture its spirit, control the hunt, ensure the tribe's survival. The cave was both temple and textbook, a place where humans first began to tell stories, not with words, but with images. And so, the story of Spain begins not with kings or empires, but with artists who never knew they were artists. Altamira reminds us that Spain's first chapters were written in ochre and blood, in the cries of hunters, in the silence of caves. But why does this matter today? Because Altamira is not just a prehistoric relic. It is a symbol. It tells us that even in the harshest conditions, humans long for beauty, for expression, for a voice that outlasts their own breath. Spain's later centuries would echo this same truth. From Velázquez's brushstrokes to Picasso's Guernica, from flamenco's cry to Lorca's poems, the hunger to turn suffering into art has always been at the heart of Spanish identity. Consider this. The people of Altamira had no borders, no armies, no flags. Yet they created something so enduring that it still speaks across millennia. Spain's history, so often defined by conflict and empire, begins here with a paradox. Its first masterpiece was born not from conquest, but from contemplation. Not from a king's decree, but from a tribe's whispered hope. And so, Altamira stands as Spain's first scripture. Not written in Latin, not spoken in Castilian, but painted in silence by hands that trembled with both fear and wonder. These walls carry the earliest heartbeat of a nation that would, centuries later, rise and fall 1,000 times. When we walk into that cave today, we are not just tourists. We are witnesses. We see the shadows of our ancestors, crouched by the fire, reaching out to the stone as if to touch eternity. And we realize, Spain's history does not begin with the empire of Charles V, nor the voyages of Columbus. It begins with a handprint pressed against the rock of Altamira. A hand that says, "We were here, we lived, we dreamed." This is the dawn of Spain. After the echoes of Altamira faded into the mists of time, new peoples arrived, bringing with them new languages, customs, and dreams. The Iberian Peninsula became a meeting ground, a frontier of civilizations where two great currents flowed together. The Iberians in the east and south, and the Celts in the north and west. Out of their meeting and their clashing emerged the first sparks of what we might call a Spanish identity. The Iberians, likely descendants of Mediterranean settlers, built fortified towns on hillsides and lived by the sea. They traded with Phoenicians and Greeks, mastering agriculture and crafting intricate sculptures of stone and bronze. They were people of the olive tree and the grapevine, skilled in commerce, their culture leaning toward the Mediterranean world. Their gods, carved into idols, bore the mysterious expressions of a people already reaching for the divine. The Celts, by contrast, swept down from Central Europe, bringing with them the warrior's fire. They settled the rugged highlands and valleys of the north and west, where the land was harsher and the rivers wilder. They were masters of metalwork, leaving behind weapons and jewelry that spoke of both power and artistry. They lived for battle and for honor, carrying with them myths that echoed with the clash of swords and the cry of warriors. At first, these two peoples were worlds apart, one Mediterranean, one European. But over centuries, they met, mingled, and clashed, until something new was born, the Celtiberians. This fusion of Celt and Iberian blood created a people both fierce and resilient. Their villages dotted the peninsula's heartlands. Their warriors fought with unmatched ferocity, and their traditions became the first real tapestry of Spanish culture. Imagine the sight of a Celtiberian warrior, his body painted, his sword forged in iron, his shield etched with patterns of sun and storm. Imagine the Iberian artisan chiseling stone into the haunting Dama de Elche, her headdress rising like the future towers of cathedrals. Together, these people forged not just weapons and art, but an identity rooted in mixture. This is Spain's first great paradox. It was never born from a single tribe, a single bloodline, a single culture. From the very beginning, Spain was plural. A crossroads, a place where identities collided and intertwined. The Celtiberians remind us that Spain's strength has always been found in blending, not in purity. Their influence did not end in myth. When Rome arrived, it was the Celtiberians who resisted most fiercely, their city of Numancia becoming a symbol of defiance. Even in death, they carried Spain's future in their veins. The refusal to be conquered easily, the pride of a people who would rather burn their homes than bow to foreign rule. So, when we look back to this time, before crowns, before crosses, before empires, we find the first embers of Spain's soul. A soul of contradiction, forged from opposites. The Iberian merchant and the Celtic warrior, the plow and the sword, the altar and the battlefield. Spain's history has often been written in division, North against South, Christian against Muslim, monarchy against republic. But its very beginning whispers another truth. Identity was born not from separation, but from blending. The Celtiberians remind us that Spain's destiny was always to be many things at once. And so, as the wind swept across the peninsula's mountains and valleys, a new fire burned. The first sparks of a nation that would one day set the world ablaze. This was not yet Spain, but it was the beginning of Spain's story. By the first millennium before Christ, the Iberian Peninsula was no longer a forgotten corner at the edge of Europe. It had become a magnet, a land whose coasts lured sailors from across the Mediterranean. They came not as conquerors at first, but as merchants. They brought with them ships heavy with goods, languages that had never been spoken here, and ideas that would forever change the destiny of this land. The first to arrive were the Phoenicians, master traders from the eastern Mediterranean. To them, the sea was not a barrier, but a highway. They founded Gadir, today's Cadiz, around 1100 BCE, making it one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in Europe. For the Phoenicians, Iberia was a treasure chest. Metals like silver and tin, fertile lands, and fish-rich waters. But they brought more than trade. They introduced the olive tree and the vine, gifts that would become eternal symbols of Spanish soil. They brought writing too, the alphabet, tiny marks on clay that would one day evolve into Spain's many languages. Then came the Greeks, establishing colonies such as Emporion, present-day Empúries, on the northeastern coast. With them came not only amphoras filled with wine, but also coins, markets, and philosophies. The Greeks turned commerce into culture, teaching the Iberians not just to trade, but to think in terms of exchange, law, and civic life. They painted pottery with mythological scenes, sold olive oil pressed in clay jars, and introduced the very concept of money, transforming the rhythms of daily life on the peninsula. But while the Phoenicians and Greeks wove threads of trade and culture, another power loomed over the horizon: Carthage. Born from Phoenician blood but hardened into empire, Carthage set its eyes on Iberia as both a prize and a battlefield. For Carthage, Iberia was a source of strength, soldiers, resources, and above all, silver to finance its wars against Rome. Here enters one of history's most unforgettable figures, Hannibal Barca. In the 3rd century BCE, Carthage's generals swore eternal enmity against Rome. From Iberian soil, he launched one of the boldest campaigns in ancient history. With an army of mercenaries, many recruited from Iberian tribes, and a herd of war elephants, Hannibal marched across the Pyrenees, through Gaul, and over the Alps, striking terror into the heart of Italy. It was a feat so audacious that it remains etched into the world's memory. And its origin was here, in Iberia. This reveals Iberia's great secret: geography as destiny. Situated at the western edge of the Mediterranean and the gateway to the Atlantic, the peninsula was a bridge between worlds. Whoever controlled it could control trade, armies, and empires. From the beginning, Spain was not isolated. It was coveted. Yet, amidst the clash of Phoenicians, Greeks, and Carthaginians, something deeper was happening. The Iberians absorbed foreign ideas and made them their own. They learned to write, to mint coins, to cultivate vines. They became both students and shapers of Mediterranean culture. Every arrival left a trace. Every exchange planted a seed. And so, by the time Rome's gaze turned toward Iberia, the land was already a crossroads of civilizations. Its soil was layered with cultures like sediment, Phoenician letters, Greek amphoras, Carthaginian war camps. Each layer told the same story. Iberia was never just a periphery. It was a stage upon which the drama of empires would unfold. The foreign merchants thought they came only to trade. In truth, they carried the sparks that would ignite Spain's destiny. The clash between Carthage and Rome would decide not only the fate of the Mediterranean, but also the destiny of the Iberian Peninsula. When Hannibal marched his elephants across the Alps, he carried with him not only Carthage's ambition, but also Iberia's warriors and resources. Rome understood this clearly. Whoever held Hispania would hold the key to victory. The Punic Wars became the crucible that dragged Iberia into Rome's orbit. Over nearly 2 centuries, from the 3rd to the 1st century BCE, Rome fought, conquered, and bled for control of the peninsula. It was not easy. The Celtiberian tribes resisted with legendary ferocity. Cities like Numantia chose death over surrender, burning their homes and starving themselves rather than kneel to foreign rule. To this day, Numancia stands as a symbol of Spain's eternal defiance, a scar carved into the memory of empire. But Rome was relentless. Step by step, legion by legion, they built roads, forts, and alliances. By the time Augustus reigned in the 1st century BCE, Hispania was no longer a frontier. It was Rome itself. And what a transformation followed. Romanization swept across the land like a tide. Towns rose with forums and aqueducts. Laws in Latin replaced tribal customs and dialects. Stone roads connected mountains to coasts, allowing soldiers, merchants, and ideas to flow like rivers. The olive groves planted by Phoenicians and Greeks now stretched under Roman hands, producing oil traded across the empire. Christianity, too, began its long journey here, whispered first among small communities before rising as the faith of emperors. Some of Rome's greatest figures were not Romans at all, but sons of Hispania. Trajan, the conqueror of Dacia and builder of Rome's greatest forum, was born in Italica, near today's Seville. His successor, Hadrian, also from Hispania, strengthened the empire's frontiers, building the famous wall in distant Britain. And Theodosius, another Hispano-Roman, would become the last emperor to rule a united Roman Empire before its permanent split. Hispania was no longer a province. It was a heart pumping blood into Rome itself. Yet glory and ruin often walked together. The mines of silver and gold enriched the empire, but they also exhausted the land and its people. Rome's heavy taxes and endless wars drained Hispania. As the empire faltered in the 4th and 5th centuries, so too did its grip on this distant province. The roads that once carried legions now carried invaders. The aqueducts that brought water cracked and crumbled. The empire that had given Hispania law, language, and faith was itself collapsing. And so, as the Western Roman Empire staggered to its knees, Hispania faced a new chapter. The Visigoths, wandering warriors from the north, marched into this fractured land. With them, a new dream emerged. The dream of unity under a Christian crown. But that dream, like so many in Spain's history, would prove fragile. Still, Rome's shadow never left. The Latin language endured, evolving into Spanish, Catalan, Galician, and Portuguese. The Roman roads became the skeleton of modern Spain's geography. The aqueducts, like the one still standing in Segovia, remained silent witnesses to a time when Hispania was Rome's jewel. To speak of Spain today is to speak Latin without knowing it. Rome buried itself so deeply in Iberian soil that even when its empire died, its voice lived on. Hispania was conquered, but in conquering, it conquered Rome in return. By giving Rome some of its greatest sons, and by keeping Rome's soul alive long after the empire's ashes had scattered. This was Rome's gift, and Rome's curse. This was Hispania, the great Roman land. When Rome's grip loosened and its empire fell into shadows, the Iberian Peninsula became vulnerable once again. Into this fractured land came the Visigoths, Germanic warriors who had once roamed as nomads, now seeking a kingdom of their own. They marched south, settled in Toledo, and declared Hispania theirs. For the first time since the legions had departed, the idea of unity returned, fragile but undeniable. The Visigoths inherited a broken land, scarred by centuries of Roman glory and decline. They did not erase Rome's legacy. Instead, they built upon it. Toledo became their capital, a city where Roman law mixed with Gothic tradition, where bishops debated theology under vaulted ceilings, and where the dream of a unified Christian kingdom took root. That dream found its clearest voice in King Recared, who in 589 famously converted from Arian Christianity, a faith that denied Christ's divinity, to Catholicism. His conversion was not only spiritual, but political. By aligning with the Roman Church, Recared forged a bond between crown and altar, laying the foundations of Spain's long marriage between monarchy and Catholicism. From this moment, religion would become more than faith. It would become identity, a force shaping every century that followed. The Visigoths also codified laws in the Liber Judiciorum, a sweeping legal code that blended Roman jurisprudence with Gothic custom. For the first time, Hispania had a body of law that treated Romans and Goths as one people. Unity, at least on parchment, was being written into existence. But unity in Spain has always been fragile. and the Visigoths were no exception. Their throne was haunted by instability. Succession was never secure. Kings rose and fell, often by assassination, betrayal, or rebellion. The nobility squabbled, bishops schemed, and ambitious generals dreamed of crowns. Unity was spoken of, but division was practiced. This fragility came to a breaking point in 711 at the Battle of Guadalete. King Rodrigo, the last Visigothic monarch, faced an invading Muslim force led by Tariq ibn Ziyad. The battle was more than a clash of armies. It was the unraveling of a dream. Rodrigo's forces collapsed, some say betrayed from within by rival nobles. Legend claims Rodrigo himself vanished, his body never found, as if swallowed by the earth. With that defeat, the gates of Hispania swung open and the armies of Islam poured in. The fall of the Visigoths was swift, almost shockingly so. In less than a decade, nearly all of Iberia was under Muslim control. The Visigothic kingdom, once poised to unite the land, dissolved like mist at sunrise. And yet, the Visigoths left behind more than ruins. They left the memory of unity, of Toledo as a capital, of Christianity as a national bond, of laws that applied to all. These seeds, though buried under centuries of Muslim rule, would later be revived during the Reconquista. Spain's monarchs would remember the Visigoths not for their fall, but for their dream. One land, one faith, one crown. But history is cruel. Before that dream could be resurrected, Hispania would enter one of its most dazzling and complex chapters. The crescent moon of Islam was rising, and with it would come an era of science, art, and convivencia, the coexistence of faiths that would make Spain the envy of the world. The Visigoths dreamed of unity. The Muslims built a civilization. The year 711 marked a turning point not only for Iberia, but for Europe itself. Out of North Africa, across the narrow Strait of Gibraltar, came an army led by Tariq ibn Ziyad. Legend says that upon reaching the peninsula, Tariq burned his ships, telling his men, "Behind you is the sea, before you is the enemy. There is no turning back." With that act of fire, Iberia's destiny changed forever. In just a few years, the Muslim conquest swept across almost the entire peninsula. Toledo, once the Visigothic capital, fell. Cities that had carried Rome's legacy now raised the crescent banner. Only a small pocket of resistance clung to the mountains of Asturias in the north. For the rest of the land, a new era began. Al-Andalus. At its height, Al-Andalus became one of the jewels of the medieval world. Córdoba, its capital, shone brighter than any city in Christian Europe. By the 10th century, it boasted nearly 500,000 inhabitants, paved streets, running water, and public baths, luxuries that Paris or London could barely imagine. Its great mosque, the Mesquita, rose like a forest of red and white arches, a masterpiece of light and geometry still standing today. But Córdoba was more than stone and mortar. It was a library of the world. While much of Europe struggled through what some call the Dark Ages, Al-Andalus collected, translated, and preserved the wisdom of Greece, Rome, and the East. Its libraries held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Scholars like Averroes, the philosopher, reintroduced Aristotle to the West. Maimonides, the Jewish thinker, reshaped theology and medicine. Science, philosophy, and poetry flourished side by side under the Andalusian sky. This was convivencia, the coexistence of Muslims, Christians, and Jews. Though not equal in power, these communities lived, traded, and studied together in ways rarely seen elsewhere. The bells of churches, the chants of synagogues, and the call to prayer from minarets mingled in the same air. It was fragile, often interrupted by intolerance or revolt, but it created a society that pulsed with cultural diversity. Yet Al-Andalus was not a utopia. Power struggles fractured it again and again. The Umayyad dynasty ruled as emirs and later as caliphs, claiming independence from the distant Abbasids in Baghdad. But by the 11th century, civil wars splintered the realm into smaller kingdoms called taifas. These taifas, though brilliant in art and architecture, were politically weak. They turned to North African dynasties for help, and in doing so, invited harsher rulers who brought stricter interpretations of Islam and heavier burdens upon the land. Still, the legacy of Al-Andalus cannot be erased. Its gardens, where water trickled through marbled channels, its palaces, like the Alhambra in Granada, where walls shimmer with calligraphy, its music, where the oud's strings still echo in modern flamenco, all of these remain Spain's inheritance. Al-Andalus was not merely a chapter, it was a transformation. It showed that Spain could be more than a battlefield. It could be a beacon. In its streets, knowledge survived the night of medieval Europe. In its courtyards, faiths and cultures intertwined. In its mosques and palaces, beauty was carved into stone, whispering across centuries. But Spain's history is a pendulum. For every rise, there is a fall. While Al-Andalus reached dazzling heights, in the north, Christian kingdoms were gathering strength. In the mountains of Asturias, León, Navarra, and Aragon, the fire of resistance was lit. The Reconquista had begun, a struggle that would last nearly 800 years. For now, though, the crescent moon shone bright. Al-Andalus was the envy of the world. History often bends like a bow, and in Spain, the bow was drawn for nearly 8 centuries. What began in the shadows of defeat at Guadalete in 711 would become one of the longest struggles in human history, the Reconquista. It was not a single war, but a rhythm of battles, alliances, betrayals, and faith spanning generations. It was the forging of Spain in fire and blood. The story begins in the north, in the rugged mountains of Asturias. In 722, a small band of Christian fighters, led by a noble named Pelayo, defeated a Muslim force at the Battle of Covadonga. On the surface, it was a minor skirmish, barely noticed in Córdoba, but in memory, it became a seed. The Christians saw in it not survival, but destiny. From this spark, the Reconquista was born. Over the centuries, small Christian realms took shape. León, Castilla, Aragon, Navarra, and later Portugal. These kingdoms were fractured, often fighting one another as much as their Muslim neighbors. Yet each carried the same vision, that one day, the cross would return to every corner of Iberia. And then there was El Cid. Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar, known as El Cid Campeador, lived in the 11th century and became Spain's most enduring knight. He fought for Christian kings, but also served Muslim rulers as a mercenary. To some, he was a hero, to others, an opportunist. But in the epic poem El Cantar de mi Cid, he became immortal, a symbol of courage, loyalty, and the paradoxes of war in medieval Spain. His story captures the spirit of the Reconquista. Complex, brutal, yet endlessly romanticized. The struggle ebbed and flowed. The Caliphate of Córdoba collapsed, replaced by the Taifas, smaller Muslim states that were rich in culture but weak in unity. Christian kingdoms seized opportunities, pushing southward, city by city, valley by valley. In 1212, at the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa, a coalition of Christian forces won a decisive victory over the Almohads, breaking Muslim power in central Iberia. From that day, the tide of history turned. By the 13th century, Seville, Córdoba, and Valencia fell into Christian hands. Only Granada remained, its Nasrid dynasty holding on for 2 more centuries. Granada became a glittering last refuge of Al-Andalus, with the Alhambra Palace rising as a dream carved in stone. But even dreams cannot last forever. In 1492, the final act arrived. Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castilla, the Catholic monarchs, united their crowns and launched the final campaign. The siege of Granada was long, its end inevitable. When the city surrendered, its last sultan, Boabdil, rode into exile. Legend says that as he looked back one final time at the city he had lost, his mother rebuked him. "Do not weep like a woman for what you could not defend like a man." The Reconquista was over. After nearly 800 years, the cross once again crowned Iberia. But the cost had been immense. Endless battles, rivers of blood, centuries of division. Yet out of this crucible, a new Spain was forged, Christian, united, and poised to reach beyond its borders. And so, 1492 became more than an ending. It was also a beginning. That same year, Ferdinand and Isabella would send Christopher Columbus across the ocean, launching Spain into an empire where, as they boasted, the sun would never set. But before empire, there was fire. Before glory, there was blood. The Reconquista was not just a war of swords. It was the shaping of a nation's soul. Spain was reborn, but its scars would remain forever. Few marriages in history have reshaped the world as much as the union of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon in 1469. What began as a political alliance between 2 ambitious monarchs became the foundation of a new nation, Spain. Together, they were known as the Reyes Católicos, the Catholic monarchs. And under their rule, the peninsula's fractured kingdoms were stitched into a single crown. Their reign was marked by iron will and relentless purpose. Isabella, sharp-minded and devout, was the soul of Castile. Ferdinand, pragmatic and calculating, embodied the traditions of Aragon. Alone, each might have ruled well. Together, they became a force of destiny. Their motto was clear: one crown, one faith, one Spain. The symbol of their triumph was Granada. After centuries of Reconquista, the last Muslim stronghold fell to their armies in January 1492. The moment was staged as theater. The banners of Castile and Aragon unfurled on the Alhambra's towers, the cross raised high over the red fortress of the Nasrids. Boabdil, the last sultan, surrendered the keys of the city with trembling hands. Spain was now united under Christianity for the first time since the Visigoths. But unity came at a cost. That same year, the Inquisition reached its terrible height. Established earlier in their reign, it sought to enforce religious conformity by rooting out heresy. Jews who had lived in Iberia for centuries were forced to convert or leave. Muslims too faced the choice between baptism or exile. For the monarchs, faith was inseparable from identity. But in pursuit of unity, they carved scars that would haunt Spain for generations. The dream of convivencia, coexistence, ended in fire and exile. And yet, 1492 was also the year of boundless horizons. Christopher Columbus, backed by Isabella's daring vision and gold, set sail westward. His arrival in the Americas opened the door to an empire unlike any the world had seen. From Mexico to Peru, from the Caribbean to the Philippines, Spain became the first global power. an empire where, as people said with awe and envy, the sun never set. The Catholic monarchs also turned their gaze inward. They reformed administration, centralized royal power, and subdued unruly nobles who had once torn Castile and Aragon apart. Under their reign, the idea of Spain as a single nation, not just a patchwork of kingdoms, began to take shape. The crown became more than a symbol. It became an institution binding diverse lands together. Their marriage was not one of romance alone. It was strategy, diplomacy, and iron discipline. Yet behind the political theater, Isabella and Ferdinand were remembered as individuals of extraordinary will. Isabella rode into battle in armor, rallying her troops at Granada. Ferdinand, ever the tactician, forged alliances that extended Spain's reach across Europe. Together, they gave their dynasty legitimacy and Spain direction. Still, contradictions followed them. Their Spain was united but intolerant, strong but fragile, devout but ruthless. They lit the torch of empire, but they also sharpened the sword of persecution. They ended 8 centuries of Muslim rule, but silenced voices that had once enriched the peninsula's culture. When Isabella died in 1504, Ferdinand mourned not just a queen, but the half of himself that made Spain whole. She was buried simply, her coffin inscribed with words that spoke not of empire, but of faith. In death, as in life, Isabella remained the embodiment of Spain's paradox. Glory and sacrifice, ambition and devotion, triumph and tragedy. The reign of the Catholic monarchs was a hinge of history. Behind them lay the medieval world of divided kingdoms. Before them stretched the dawn of empire, of conquest, of Spain as a nation whose name would echo across continents. Spain had been reborn, but the price of that rebirth was both its greatest strength and its deepest wound. The 16th and 17th centuries are remembered as Spain's Siglo de Oro, its golden age. It was an era when Spanish ships rode every ocean, when Spanish armies marched across Europe, and when Spanish art and literature burned with a brilliance that still dazzles the world. Yet, like so much in Spain's history, the gold came mixed with shadows. Prosperity and ruin walked hand in hand. Glory and decay shared the same stage. The empire stretched across continents. In the west, Mexico and Peru fell under Spanish banners, their riches flowing into Seville and Madrid. The mines of Potosi in the Andes became symbols of empire, mountains of silver feeding the royal treasury. Galleons crossed the Atlantic in fleets, heavy with bullion and guarded by cannon. From the east, the Manila galleons connected Spain to Asia, carrying spices, porcelain, and silk across the vast Pacific. For the first time in history, a single crown linked the old world and the new. On maps, Spain appeared invincible. Naples, Milan, and the Low Countries belonged to the crown. The Philippines bore its name. The Habsburg monarch, Charles V, ruled over a realm so vast that he could truly claim, "The sun never sets on my empire." His successor, Philip II, made Madrid the beating heart of this global kingdom, ruling from the grand halls of El Escorial, the austere palace monastery that symbolized both power and piety. But empires are built on fragile foundations. The wealth pouring in from the Americas fueled not only glory, but inflation. Prices soared, common people starved, and Spain's economy, so dependent on imported silver, grew brittle. Wars drained the treasury. The 80 Years' War in the Low Countries, endless conflicts with France, and the doomed Armada against England in 1588 all consumed fortunes and lives. Still, amidst the struggle, culture flourished. If Spain's soldiers held the world's battlefields, its artists and writers conquered eternity. Miguel de Cervantes gave the world Don Quixote, the first modern novel, a story of dreams clashing with reality, as timeless as Spain itself. In theaters, Lope de Vega and Calderón de la Barca filled stages with poetry and passion. On canvas, Diego Velázquez painted kings, jesters, and commoners with unmatched humanity, while El Greco's mystic figures stretched toward heaven with unearthly light. Spanish culture in this era was not just an accessory to empire, it was its soul. And yet, the Golden Age was haunted by contradictions. The same Spain that produced Las Meninas also expelled its Jewish and Muslim communities, silencing voices that had once enriched its soil. The same Spain that ruled across oceans struggled with famine at home. Splendor rose from palaces, while villages sank into poverty. Perhaps that is why the Golden Age still captivates. It was not golden because it was perfect. It was golden because it glowed brightest against the darkness gathering around it. Spain's empire burned like a sun, casting light across the world, even as its own foundations cracked. By the late 17th century, the signs of decay were undeniable. Silver shipments dwindled, soldiers went unpaid, and Spain's enemies circled. The grandeur of Velázquez's portraits hid a monarchy increasingly hollow, its strength slipping away. And yet, in those centuries, Spain gave the world something eternal. Not just empire, but imagination. Not just conquest, but creativity. The Golden Age ensured that even when Spain's power faded, its voice would never be silenced. The sun did not truly never set. In time, it would sink, and the empire would fragment. But in literature, in art, in memory, the sun of Spain's Golden Age still shines. Every empire carries within it the seeds of its own decay. For Spain, those seeds sprouted in the late 17th century, when the once mighty Habsburg dynasty collapsed under the weight of mismanagement, endless wars, and blood weakened by generations of intermarriage. The Golden Age had shone brightly, but now the shadows grew long. The figure who came to embody this decline was King Charles II, remembered by history with a cruel nickname, El Hechizado, the Bewitched. Born sickly and disfigured, Charles suffered from the inbreeding that plagued the Habsburg line. His jaw was so deformed he could barely chew. His body was frail, his mind clouded. For decades, Spain was ruled by a king more ghost than monarch, a tragic symbol of a dynasty exhausted. Under Charles II, Spain's empire bled away. The silver fleets dwindled, drained by piracy and overuse. In Europe, territories were lost to stronger rivals. Portugal had already broken free, and France, under Louis XIV, pressed relentlessly at Spain's borders. At home, famine and plague cut down peasants, while nobles schemed for influence around a powerless court. The grandeur of Velázquez's canvases and Cervantes's prose had given way to silence and stagnation. When Charles II died in 1700, he left no heir. His death was not just the end of a man, but the extinction of a dynasty that had ruled Spain for nearly 2 centuries. Into the vacuum rushed Europe's great powers, each eager to claim the spoils of a fading empire. Thus began the War of Spanish Succession, a conflict that would redraw the map of Europe. The contenders were stark. On one side stood the Bourbon candidate, Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France. On the other, the Austrian Habsburgs, desperate to keep Spain's vast territories from falling under French influence. For a decade, from 1701 to 1714, Spain became the battlefield of Europe, its soil soaked once again in blood. The war tore Spain apart. Castile largely supported the Bourbons, while Catalonia, Valencia, and Aragon leaned toward the Habsburg cause. Battles raged not only between foreign armies, but between Spaniards themselves, foreshadowing the fractures that would haunt the nation centuries later. In 1714, the Bourbon cause triumphed. Philip of Anjou became Philip V, the first Bourbon king of Spain. But the price was heavy. The Treaty of Utrecht forced Spain to surrender vast holdings. Flanders and much of Italy slipped away, while Gibraltar was handed to Britain, where it remains to this day. The empire that had once stretched across continents was now diminished, its glory dimmed. Yet, in this loss lay transformation. The Bourbons brought with them the centralized reforms of France. They sought to modernize Spain's administration, strengthen its army, and rebuild a state that had decayed under the last Habsburgs. Spain was weaker, yes, but it was not finished. Like a wounded giant, it stumbled, seeking renewal under new masters. The decline of the Habsburgs is a story both tragic and inevitable. Tragic, because a dynasty that had given Spain emperors, conquistadors, and artists ended in the broken figure of Charles II. Inevitable, because empires built on silver and war cannot shine forever. The sun that had refused to set now dipped toward the horizon. Spain entered the 18th century no longer the invincible empire of Philip II, but a humbled kingdom, smaller and uncertain. And yet, as always in its history, the story was not one of endings, but of transformations. From ashes, Spain would seek another rebirth. The 19th century was a storm that never seemed to end for Spain. It was an age of uprisings, invasions, and disappointments. When the empire that had once stretched across oceans shrank into fragments, and the nation itself tore at its own seams. If the Golden Age had crowned Spain with glory, the 1800s stripped it bare, leaving scars that would define its future. The first great blow came from abroad. In 1808, Napoleon's armies marched into Iberia, toppling the Bourbon king and placing his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the Spanish throne. What followed was not mere occupation, but resistance of legendary ferocity. The Guerra de Independencia, or Peninsular War. From Madrid's Dos de Mayo uprising, immortalized in Goya's haunting painting, to the relentless guerrilla campaigns in the mountains, Spaniards fought with a stubborn rage that bled Napoleon's empire. For 6 years, villages burned, civilians suffered, and armies clashed, until the French were finally driven out in 1814. Yet, independence brought no peace. Instead, it opened the floodgates of crisis. Across the Atlantic, Spain's colonies, long the jewels of its empire, seized the moment. Inspired by Enlightenment ideals and fueled by local leaders like Simón Bolívar, José de San Martín, and Miguel Hidalgo, independence movements swept through Latin America. By the 1820s, Spain's grip on its American dominions was gone. Mexico, Argentina, Colombia, Chile, Peru, all slipped away. What had once been the foundation of Spain's wealth now became free nations, leaving the mother country diminished, staring into an empty treasury. At home, division poisoned the land. The question of succession after the death of Ferdinand VII in 1833 sparked the Carlist Wars, a series of brutal civil conflicts between supporters of his daughter, Isabella II, and those of his brother, Carlos. These wars were not merely about who would wear the crown, but about two visions of Spain, one liberal and modernizing, the other traditional and absolutist. The result was decades of bloodshed, instability, and bitterness. The monarchy staggered under scandal and misrule. Queen Isabella II, though crowned as a symbol of progress, became deeply unpopular, her reign marked by corruption and political chaos. She was eventually deposed in 1868 in what Spaniards called the Glorious Revolution. For a brief time, Spain even experimented with democracy, proclaiming a republic in 1873. But the republic collapsed under the weight of internal divisions and lack of support. The monarchy returned, fragile and weary, under Alfonso XII. Meanwhile, Spain's economy faltered. While Britain and France surged forward with industrial revolutions, Spain lagged behind. Clinging to rural traditions and feudal structures, railroads were late, factories scarce, and peasants remained poor. It was a nation caught between centuries, unsure whether to cling to the past or march into the future. The final humiliation came in 1898, in what Spaniards still call El Desastre. After a war with the United States, Spain lost its last major colonies, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. The empire that had once dominated the globe was gone. The nation where the sun never set now seemed like a faded shadow, humbled and broken. And yet, in the midst of crisis, voices of brilliance rose. Francisco de Goya, with his black paintings, captured the horrors of war and the madness of kings. Later, writers and thinkers of the Generación del 98, Unamuno, Machado, Azorín, poured their despair and hope into words, asking what Spain truly was after empire, after humiliation. Their question still echoes. Is Spain defined by its conquests or by its capacity to endure? The 19th century left Spain exhausted, impoverished, and fractured. Civil wars had bled it dry, colonies had slipped away, dreams of grandeur had turned to dust. And yet, even in ruin, Spain clung to life. Like so often in its history, it staggered forward, wounded but unbroken, searching once again for rebirth. By the early 20th century, Spain was a nation adrift. The empire was gone, the monarchy weakened, and the promises of modernization had failed to reach the villages where most Spaniards still lived in poverty. Discontent simmered everywhere, among workers demanding rights, peasants without land, and intellectuals demanding reform. When King Alfonso XIII's monarchy collapsed in 1931, the Second Republic was declared. For a moment, hope filled the air. Hope for land reform, women's suffrage, secular schools, and a new Spain built on democracy. But the hopes of one Spain quickly became the fears of another. Conservatives, monarchists, the church, and the army saw the Republic's reforms as an attack on tradition. Landowners resisted redistribution. Priests denounced secularization, and generals plotted in silence. At the same time, leftist forces pushed harder. Anarchists, socialists, communists, each demanding deeper change. Spain was a country split in two, a nation staring at itself in the mirror and refusing to recognize the reflection. In July 1936, the fragile balance snapped. A military uprising led by General Francisco Franco and other officers erupted against the Republic. What followed was not just a coup, but a war that would rip Spain apart. The Spanish Civil War. It was a conflict that became larger than Spain itself. The world saw it as a rehearsal for global war. Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy sent planes, tanks, and troops to Franco's nationalists. The Soviet Union backed the Republicans, while volunteers from around the world Writers, students, workers joined the international brigades to defend democracy. Spain became the front line of an ideological struggle. Fascism versus democracy, tradition versus revolution. The war was brutal, merciless. Villages were burned, families torn apart, neighbors turned executioners. In 1937, the Basque town of Guernica was bombed by German planes in one of the first modern aerial bombardments targeting civilians. The devastation was immortalized by Pablo Picasso in his painting Guernica, a scream on canvas, a cry of anguish that still embodies the horror of war. But the atrocities were not confined to one side. Both nationalists and Republicans committed massacres, executions, and repressions. Spain's soil became a graveyard of ideology, where mercy was rare and cruelty common. For 3 years, the country bled. In 1939, Franco's nationalists emerged victorious. The Republic crumbled, its leaders fled or were executed, and hundreds of thousands of Spaniards were forced into exile. Franco entered Madrid as the undisputed ruler, beginning a dictatorship that would last nearly 4 decades. Yet the war never truly ended. Its scars cut too deep. Families remained divided between victors and vanquished. Graves remained unmarked, bodies hidden in mass pits. The silence that followed was not peace, but repression. Spain carried the war like a wound that refused to heal, an open sore of memory and loss. Even today, the Spanish Civil War haunts the nation. Streets, monuments, and political debates still echo with its ghosts. It was not just a war of bullets and bombs. It was a war of identity. What is Spain? A land of tradition or a land of revolution? A Catholic kingdom or a secular republic? The Civil War did not answer these questions. It only carved them deeper. In the end, the war destroyed not only lives, but hope. A generation was lost. Dreams of democracy and reform were buried under rubble. And Spain entered a new era, not of freedom, but of silence, under the iron hand of Francisco Franco. The Civil War was Spain's greatest tragedy, not a battle against a foreign invader, but a nation devouring itself. And like all such tragedies, its echoes never fade. When the Spanish Civil War ended in 1939, the victors marched beneath Franco's banners. But what followed was not triumph for the nation. It was suffocation. Francisco Franco, the general who had risen from rebellion to supreme power, crowned himself caudillo, the sole authority of Spain. His regime would last for 36 years, a dictatorship that blanketed the country in silence and fear. Franco's Spain was built on repression. Political opponents were executed, imprisoned, or forced into exile. Thousands disappeared into prisons or mass graves, while families whispered in terror, never knowing if a neighbor's words might lead to their arrest. The press was censored, books banned, and voices silenced. Intellectuals and artists fled to Paris, Mexico, Buenos Aires, wherever freedom still breathed. Spain's brightest minds, like poets and professors, became exiles wandering the earth. The Catholic Church, elevated by Franco, became the moral pillar of the state. Religion was no longer a personal faith, but a political weapon. Schools taught obedience, not inquiry. Women were bound by laws that reduced them to wives and mothers, stripped of the freedoms briefly won during the Republic. Spain became a fortress of conservatism, its doors shut against the currents of modern Europe. Economically, the first decades were bleak. Isolation followed World War II, as Franco's fascist leanings left Spain shunned by the international community. Hunger haunted villages. Black markets thrived. People spoke of the años del hambre, the years of hunger, when bread was scarce and hope even scarcer. It was a silence not only of politics, but of empty stomachs. Yet history is never static. By the 1950s, as Cold War tensions rose, the United States and other Western powers saw Franco not as a pariah, but as a useful ally against communism. Slowly, Spain was brought back into the global fold. Military bases were built, aid trickled in, and Franco's regime gained reluctant legitimacy abroad. The 1960s brought change within. Franco's ministers, known as the technocrats, opened the economy to tourism and foreign investment. Beaches of the Costa del Sol filled with visitors, and the slogan, "Spain is different," became a lure for curious travelers. Football stadiums roared with Real Madrid's victories, while highways, factories, and skyscrapers sprouted. For the first time in decades, many Spaniards saw prosperity, but it was uneven. Cities grew, while rural Spain remained trapped in poverty. Development masked repression, but never erased it. Still, beneath the surface, resistance endured. Students demanded freedom. Workers struck in defiance of bans. Basque separatists and Catalan nationalists, suppressed by Franco's centralist vision of one Spain, one language, one people, nurtured underground movements. The dictator ruled with an iron fist, but cracks in the wall of silence widened as the years dragged on. When Franco died in 1975, Spain was left with an unsettling question: what next? His body was laid in the Valley of the Fallen, a vast monument he had built to glorify victory. But even in death, he cast a shadow. He had ruled so long that an entire generation had never known another Spain. His passing was both relief and uncertainty, an end and a beginning. Francoism was more than dictatorship. It was a long night over Spain's soul. It shaped memory, identity, and politics in ways that still ripple today. For some, it brought stability. For many, it brought silence, hunger, and fear. It left wounds unspoken, graves unmarked, histories unwritten. The question of Franco is the question of memory itself. Can a nation move forward while shadows still linger? For nearly 4 decades, Spain lived in those shadows. Only with his death could the possibility of dawn return. But dawn would not come automatically. It had to be fought for, again. When Francisco Franco died in November 1975, Spain stood at a crossroads. For 36 years, the dictatorship had ruled with silence, fear, and iron control. Now the caudillo was gone, and a nation long shackled by repression faced a question it had asked for centuries. Could Spain finally be free and remain united? The figure who stepped forward was unexpected. Juan Carlos III Franco himself had handpicked him as successor, believing the young Bourbon prince would preserve the regime. Yet once crowned, Juan Carlos stunned the world. Instead of clinging to dictatorship, he began to dismantle it. With quiet determination, he set Spain on the path to democracy. His ally in this transformation was Adolfo Suarez, a shrewd politician and former Francoist minister. Suarez understood both the language of the old regime and the aspirations of the new. Together, Juan Carlos and Suarez built a bridge from authoritarianism to democracy. A fragile, daring bridge, but one that would hold. The milestones came quickly. Political parties were legalized. Censorship was lifted. Exiles returned from Paris, Mexico, and Buenos Aires. In 1977, Spain held its first free elections in over 4 decades. The following year, a new constitution was written and approved by referendum. It declared Spain a parliamentary monarchy, guaranteed civil liberties, and recognized the rights of its regions to autonomy. The long dream of liberty had been put to paper. But the transition, la transición, was not smooth. Old ghosts resisted. On February 23, 1981, armed civil guards stormed the parliament, rifles raised, in a dramatic coup attempt known simply as 23F. For hours, Spain held its breath, uncertain whether democracy would survive. Then, in a moment that defined his reign, King Juan Carlos appeared on television in military uniform, condemning the coup and ordering the army to stand down. His voice carried authority, but more importantly, legitimacy. The coup collapsed. Spain chose democracy. The world looked on in astonishment. Where so many nations stumbled from dictatorship into chaos, Spain managed a relatively peaceful transition. It was not without violence. The Basque separatist group ETA unleashed terror campaigns, and memories of civil war haunted families. But compared to its own bloody past, the transition was a miracle. It was also a rebirth. Freed from isolation, Spain rejoined Europe. Its regions, Catalonia, the Basque Country, Galicia, regained autonomy. Their languages and cultures recognized once more. Universities and newspapers flourished, and artists, filmmakers, and writers who had been silenced for decades filled the air with new voices. The transition was more than politics. It was psychological, cultural, spiritual. For the first time in generations, Spaniards could breathe without fear of censorship or persecution. Yet with freedom came the weight of memory. How should Spain remember Franco? Should it dig up the graves of the Civil War dead, or leave them in silence? These questions would linger, unresolved, long after the applause of democracy's birth faded. Still, the achievement was undeniable. In less than a decade, Spain moved from dictatorship to one of the most vibrant democracies in Europe. It was a transformation so improbable, so unlikely, that historians call it one of the most peaceful democratizations of the 20th century. Spain had walked out of the shadows. The night of Francoism was over, and dawn had broken. But dawn is only the beginning of the day. Ahead lay new challenges: Europe, globalization, crises, and the constant struggle to reconcile the past with the future. The transition remains one of Spain's proudest chapters, not because it was perfect, but because it was possible at all. A nation that had once destroyed itself in civil war had proven it could choose peace. The long night had ended. Spain had chosen democracy. By the 1980s, Spain was a nation reborn. After centuries of empire and decline, civil war and dictatorship, it finally stepped into democracy. And now it turned its gaze outward. To survive in the modern world, Spain could not remain isolated. It had to integrate, to connect, to become part of something larger. The first great step came in 1986, when Spain joined the European Economic Community, the forerunner of today's European Union. For a country long shut out by Franco's dictatorship, membership was both symbolic and practical. It marked Spain's acceptance into the family of European democracies. Roads, universities, and industries blossomed with European investment. The peseta gave way to the euro in 1999, tying Spain's fortunes to the continent. No longer was Spain an outlier on the map. It was at the table where Europe's future was decided. The 1990s were a time of spectacle and confidence. The Barcelona Olympics of 1992 showcased a new Spain, modern, colorful, dynamic. The Games transformed the city, turning its waterfront into a global icon. That same year, Seville hosted the World Expo, and Madrid was crowned European Capital of Culture. For a brief, shining moment, Spain became the stage where the world applauded progress. Flamenco guitars, Picasso's paintings, and the cheers of athletes painted a portrait of a nation that had shaken off its shadows. But prosperity is often fragile. In the early 2000s, Spain rode a wave of economic growth fueled by construction and real estate. Cranes towered over cities, new highways cut across the landscape, and young Spaniards believed the future was boundless. Yet the bubble burst in 2008 with the global financial crisis. The collapse of the housing market left ghostly half-built developments and soaring unemployment. Youth unemployment in particular reached staggering levels, creating a lost generation of Spaniards forced to leave for work abroad. Out of the crisis rose anger, but also activism. In 2011, the 15M movement, the Indignados, occupied city squares, demanding jobs, dignity, and a real voice in politics. Their protests echoed across Europe, inspiring movements from Athens to New York. From their energy emerged new political forces like Podemos and Ciudadanos, challenging the dominance of Spain's traditional parties and reshaping its political landscape. Meanwhile, questions of identity resurfaced. Catalonia pushed harder for independence, its demands growing louder after the crisis deepened feelings of inequality. The Basque separatist group ETA, after decades of terror, finally declared an end to violence in 2011, closing one of Spain's darkest chapters. Yet the tension between central authority and regional identity remained unresolved, a reminder that Spain's unity was always delicate, always negotiated. And still, culture carried Spain's voice far beyond its borders. Filmmaker Pedro Almodóvar brought Spanish cinema to international acclaim with stories of color and chaos. Flamenco evolved, mingling with modern rhythms, while new stars like Rosalía carried its soul into the global music scene. On the courts, Rafael Nadal fought like a modern gladiator, while in stadiums, Real Madrid and Barcelona drew millions into their rivalry, making Spanish football a global religion. Spain in the modern era is a paradox, as it has always been. It is a nation proud of its traditions, yet restless for change, integrated into Europe, yet haunted by internal fractures, scarred by crisis, yet capable of dazzling reinvention. To walk through Madrid's Puerta del Sol today, or along Barcelona's Ramblas, is to feel this tension and this energy. A country balancing between the weight of its past and the pull of its future. A Spain that knows collapse and rebirth better than most, and therefore carries resilience in its very bones. The Spain of today is not the empire of yesterday. But it has found a new power, not in conquest, but in connection. Not in silver from the Andes, but in ideas, culture, and its voice within a global world. Spain had entered modernity. But what of the century ahead? To speak of Spain in the 21st century is to step into a country suspended between memory and possibility. Here is a nation that once ruled continents, that bled in civil war, that suffocated under dictatorship, and that now walks confidently into a globalized world, though never without stumbles. Today, Spain stands firmly anchored in the European Union and NATO. Its voice respected in Brussels, its influence stretching across Latin America through language, trade, and culture. The euro circulates in Spanish pockets, and Spanish banks, businesses, and innovators shape markets far beyond the peninsula. From renewable energy to biomedical research, Spain has built industries that position it not as a shadow of empire, but as a modern state with global weight. Culturally, Spain thrives on reinvention. Directors like Pedro Almodovar and Alejandro Amenabar project Spanish cinema across oceans. Musicians like Rosalía blend flamenco's soul with modern rhythms, carrying Spain's heartbeat into global playlists. On the tennis court, Rafael Nadal embodies resilience. In football stadiums, the eternal duel of Real Madrid and Barcelona draws the gaze of millions. Spanish culture has become Spain's new empire, an empire of imagination, rhythm, and artistry. Yet challenges remain. The wounds of the past, civil war graves still unmarked, debates over Franco's legacy continue to divide memory. The Catalan question, with its push for independence, exposes the fragility of Spain's unity. Climate change threatens its dry plains and coasts. And economic inequality, sharpened by the 2008 crisis, leaves many young Spaniards still searching for stability. And here, as your narrator, I must confess a perspective. Spain's history feels like a pendulum. It swings between extremes, glory and despair, unity and fracture, tradition and revolution. But the secret of Spain is not in choosing one side of the swing. It is in the rhythm itself. Spain is a nation that survives by oscillating, by refusing final defeat, by falling and rising again. That is its destiny. That is its identity. So when we ask what Spain is today, the answer is not a single thing. Spain is Europe and Latin America, tradition and innovation, bull rings and biotech labs. Spain is a country that has been conquered a dozen times and still sings with its own voice. It is a country that tells the world, we may break, but we do not vanish. And perhaps that is Spain's greatest lesson to us all. Nations, like people, are not defined only by their triumphs. They are defined by their endurance. Spain has endured, and it will endure still. If you've journeyed with me through this story, from the caves of Altamira to the stadiums of Barcelona, you've seen not just history, but humanity, resilience, contradiction, brilliance, and scars. And if you want to keep traveling through the stories of nations, stories of survival, tragedy, and rebirth, then I invite you to subscribe to Stories of Countries. Because when we understand where we come from, we understand not only nations, but ourselves.